The year is 1780, Amsterdam. Picture this. The canals glisten under autumn sunlight, reflecting the most magnificent canal houses ever built. Merchants in velvet coats walk past warehouses stuffed with spices from Java, silver from the Americas, and textiles from India. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first, hums with activity as traders shout prices for shares in the Dutch East India Company. This is the richest city on planet Earth. The Dutch guilder is the global reserve currency, accepted from London to Canton. The Netherlands possesses the most advanced financial system in human history, a navy that controls the world's oceans, and the highest standard of living ever achieved. They are the masters of the universe. But there was a problem. If you look closely at the account books of these wealthy merchants, you would have discovered something disturbing. The money flowing through Amsterdam was no longer coming from Dutch ships, Dutch factories, or Dutch innovation. It was coming from interest payments. The richest men in Amsterdam had stopped building things. They had stopped making things. They had transformed from producers into speculators, from industrialists into financiers. And most shockingly, they were lending billions of guilders to their greatest rival, Great Britain, the very empire that would soon replace them as the global superpower. The Dutch elite had made a calculated decision. They decided to export their wealth rather than reinvest it at home. They chose to fund their competitors' rise rather than maintain their own nation's productive capacity. They executed what historians now call the Dutch pattern, the quiet, methodical dismantling of an empire from within, not through military defeat, but through financial suicide. It was not murder, it was suicide. And today, in 2026, the United States is following the exact same script. While the S&P 500 hits record highs, American bridges collapse. While Wall Street celebrates trillion-dollar valuations, the Rust Belt rusts. While BlackRock manages $10 trillion in global assets, American infrastructure receives a C- grade from civil engineers. The parallels are not just striking, they are terrifying. How does a superpower hollow itself out? Why would the wealthiest people in a nation deliberately export the very capital that made them powerful? And what does this pattern tell us about America's future? To understand what is happening to the United States today, we must travel back to Amsterdam in the 1780s. Because the Dutch didn't lose their empire in a war. They liquidated it, piece by piece, asset by asset, and their ruling class got richer in the process. This is the story of how empires die by their own hand. To understand how the Dutch lost everything, we must first understand how they won everything. In the 1600s, the Dutch Republic was the workshop of the world. They invented the Vlootschip, a cargo vessel that could carry twice the goods with half the crew of any competitor. They perfected wind-powered sawmills that processed timber faster than any rival. They created the world's first stock exchange in 1602, the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, and a system of public debt financing that allowed them to borrow at interest rates of just 3 to 4% when other nations paid 8–10%. This wasn't just wealth, this was a revolution in productivity. Amsterdam became rich because Amsterdam was productive. The Dutch guilder was the global reserve currency not because of military conquest, but because everyone wanted Dutch goods, ships, textiles, refined sugar, processed metals. The currency was backed by the sweat, the engineering, and the physical dominance of the Dutch economy. But success breeds a specific type of cancer. By 1700, Dutch wages had skyrocketed. The standard of living was the highest in the world. But this created a problem. It became expensive to manufacture in Amsterdam compared to rising competitors in England and France. Labor costs doubled between 1650 and 1700. The Dutch workforce transformed from hungry innovators into comfortable inheritors of fortune. And this is where the pivot happens. The Dutch capital holders, the merchant families who controlled the Dutch East India Company and the Bank of Amsterdam, looked at their balance sheets. They calculated that the return on investment for building a new factory in the Netherlands was falling. Domestic wages were too high. Markets were saturated. So they asked themselves a fatal question. Why should we go through the trouble of running businesses and managing workers when we can simply lend money? The shift happened slowly, over decades. But by 1750, the transformation was complete. The Dutch Republic had evolved from an economy of production to an economy of finance. They stopped being the workshop of the world and became the banker of the world. Economists celebrate this as sophistication. They call it financialization, the natural evolution of a developed nation. But in reality, it was the beginning of the death spiral. Because when an empire stops making things and starts making money from money, it has signed its own death warrant. Throughout the 1700s, something strange happened in Amsterdam. The city still looked prosperous. The stock exchange still bustled. But underneath the surface, the physical economy was rotting. The shipyards began to close. By 1780, the Dutch commercial fleet had shrunk by 40% from its peak in 1670. The fishing industry collapsed. The famous Zaandam industrial region, once home to over 600 windmills processing everything from timber to oil, saw production decline by half. The skilled engineers who built the Floyd ships died off without replacement. But the Dutch elite didn't care, because they had discovered something more profitable: foreign investment. Here's the mechanism that killed the Dutch Empire. As domestic Dutch industries became less profitable, capital holders redirected their money abroad. Specifically, they began purchasing foreign government bonds, especially British bonds. By 1773, Dutch investors held approximately 200 million guilders in foreign securities. By 1780, that figure had exploded to over 600 million guilders, roughly equivalent to 3 years of the entire Dutch Republic's GDP. Think about that. The accumulated wealth of an entire nation's golden age was being lent to foreign governments and foreign companies. Why would they do this? Because British bonds paid 5% guaranteed interest. British government debt was considered rock solid because Britain's economy was growing rapidly, industrializing, expanding its empire, building its navy. Meanwhile, investing in Dutch domestic industries returned maybe 2 to 3% if you were lucky, and carried the hassle of actually managing workers, dealing with regulations, and competing with foreign rivals. The math was simple. The consequences were catastrophic. But there was a problem. This capital export created a vicious cycle. As Dutch capital flowed abroad, Dutch industries starved for investment. As Dutch industries declined, unemployment rose. As unemployment rose, Dutch wages stagnated. As wages stagnated, tax revenues fell. As tax revenues fell, the Dutch government had to borrow more. And as the government borrowed more, it competed with Dutch industry for the same pool of capital. By 1713, Holland's public debt had reached 310 million guilders. The government was spending 65% of its annual budget just on interest payments. This was a debt trap. But instead of investing in productive assets that could grow their way out of debt, Dutch capitalists kept lending more money abroad. The Dutch East India Company, once the world's most valuable corporation, saw its stock price stagnate for 80 years. From 1680 to 1760, VOC shares barely moved, even as British East India Company shares tripled. Why? Because Dutch capital was funding Britain's expansion in India, not their own. It was a rational choice for individual capitalists. It was suicide for the nation. Capital has no fatherland. A Dutch banker didn't care if the flag flying over the Indian Ocean was Dutch or British, as long as the interest payments arrived on time. And that's the trap. When the profit motive of the elite diverges from the national interest, the empire begins to hollow out. But the story gets worse. The Dutch weren't just lending to neutral parties, they were directly funding their greatest strategic rival. In the 1770s and 1780s, Britain was fighting multiple wars against the American colonies, against France, against Spain. These wars were extraordinarily expensive. Britain's national debt exploded from $130 million in 1775 to $243 million by 1783. Where did Britain get the money to fund these wars? From Amsterdam. Dutch merchant banks acted as intermediaries, underwriting British government bonds and selling them to Dutch investors. The Amsterdam banking houses, particularly Hope and Comer and other merchant banks, specialized in what we would now call sovereign debt syndication. They would purchase large blocks of British bonds, denominate them in guilders, and sell them to wealthy Dutch investors seeking safe returns. Let's be specific. Between 1775 and 1783, Dutch investors purchased an estimated 80 million guilders worth of British war bonds. This money directly funded the Royal Navy, the same navy that would blockade Dutch ports during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War from 1780 to 1784. The irony is staggering. Dutch capital was financing the construction of British warships that would soon strangle Dutch trade. Why would Dutch bankers do this? Because the returns were spectacular. British war bonds issued during the American Revolutionary War paid 6 to 8% interest, double what Dutch domestic investments offered. And the British government, despite its enormous debt, had a track record of never defaulting. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, had created a system of permanent national debt that allowed Britain to borrow essentially unlimited sums as long as it kept paying interest. Dutch bankers looked at this and saw genius. They saw a way to earn steady, reliable income without the headache of managing actual businesses. But instead of X, they created Y. Instead of building Dutch power, they built British power. Instead of funding Dutch industry, they funded Britain's military-industrial complex. The shift is captured in Dutch economic data. In 1670, roughly 70% of Dutch capital was invested domestically in trade, manufacturing, agriculture, and real estate. By 1780, only 30% remained in domestic investments. The other 70% had migrated abroad, primarily to Britain, but also to France, Austria, Sweden, and even Russia. This was the Great Exit. Not a physical exit where people fled the country, but a financial exit, a migration of value. Dutch elites kept living in their beautiful canal houses in Amsterdam. They kept wearing their powdered wigs and attending their balls. But their wealth was no longer tied to the health of the Dutch Republic. If the Netherlands collapsed, they would still be rich because their assets were safely parked in London, earning 5% interest guaranteed by the British Crown. They had detached. They had built a lifeboat for themselves and drilled a hole in the hull of the ship for everyone else. And the Dutch middle class, the shipbuilders, the fishermen, the textile workers, the backbone of the Golden Age, began to fracture. Real wages in Amsterdam stagnated from 1730 to 1800. Social unrest increased. The Dutch Republic experienced riots in 1747, 1748, and again in the 1780s as citizens demanded economic reform. But the elite did not care, because their fortunes were no longer dependent on Dutch prosperity. And that's when everything fell apart. In 1780, war broke out between the Dutch Republic and Great Britain, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. On paper, this seemed insane. Why would Britain attack the Netherlands, the very nation whose bankers were funding British debt? Because Britain no longer needed Dutch capital. By 1780, Britain had developed its own deep capital markets. British elites had learned from the Dutch, copied their institutions, and surpassed them. Britain now had the Bank of England, a thriving London Stock Exchange, and a growing class of British investors with surplus capital. The Dutch had taught their student too well, and now the student no longer needed the teacher. The war was a disaster for the Netherlands. The British Royal Navy blockaded Dutch ports, strangled Dutch trade, and seized Dutch colonial possessions. The Dutch Navy, undermaintained and underfunded after decades of declining investment, was helpless. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1784, the Dutch Republic had lost half its remaining overseas trade. The economic cost was staggering. Dutch shipping revenues collapsed by 60% between 1780 and 1790. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange crashed. The guilder lost 30% of its value. Unemployment spiked. But here's the truly shocking part. The Dutch financial elite survived. Because their wealth was not denominated in guilders, it was denominated in British pounds, French francs, and Austrian florins. When the guilder collapsed, they didn't lose anything. In fact, some even profited. Their foreign assets increased in relative value compared to Dutch assets. The Dutch pattern reached its final stage. The nation was bankrupt, but the elite were fine. By 1795, the Dutch Republic effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. French revolutionary armies invaded, overthrew the government, and established the Batavian Republic, a French puppet state. The Dutch East India Company was liquidated in 1799. The Bank of Amsterdam collapsed in 1820. For the next 150 years, the Netherlands would remain a minor European power, economically dependent, politically irrelevant, and strategically weak. The standard of living for ordinary Dutch citizens stagnated for over a century. They went from being the masters of the world to being a province. But the merchant banking families who had exported Dutch capital? Many of them moved to London and became pillars of British finance. They didn't lose their fortunes. They simply changed addresses. Now fast forward to the United States of America. We are living through the exact same cycle. The timelines map perfectly. The U.S. had its golden age of production from 1945 to 1970. We were the workshop of the world. We made the steel, the cars, the electronics. American manufacturing output peaked as a share of GDP in 1953 at 28%. The dollar was king because American industry was king. But then the same pressures emerged. Wages rose, regulations increased. The rest of the world began to catch up. And just like the Dutch, the American elite made the pivot. In the 1980s and 1990s, we decided that manufacturing was dirty and old-fashioned. We embraced financialization. We told ourselves that America's future was in services, in software, in finance, in design, while other countries could handle the grimy work of actual production. So we dismantled the physical economy. We shipped factories to China, to Mexico, to Vietnam. Between 1980 and 2020, the United States lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. We told American workers this was good for them, that they would get cheaper goods at Walmart. But what we were really doing was the Dutch pivot. We were shutting down the engine of value creation and replacing it with the engine of financial extraction. And just like in Amsterdam, the numbers went up. GDP rose, the stock market soared, Wall Street replaced Detroit, and the elite celebrated their genius, coining terms like the Great Moderation. But all they had done was burn the furniture to heat the house. This financialization created a massive surplus of capital at the top, just as it did in the Netherlands. And this capital needed somewhere to go. It couldn't go into American factories because we had closed them. So where did it go? It went into funding the industrialization of China. American capital built the factories in Shenzhen. American venture capital funded Alibaba and Tencent. American pension funds purchased Chinese government bonds. Between 2000 and 2020, American investors poured over $2.6 trillion into Chinese securities and direct investments. The logic was identical to Amsterdam in 1770. Why pay an American worker $25 an hour when I can pay a Chinese worker $3 an hour and pocket the difference? This is the betrayal. The American elite have detached their fortune from the American nation. Today, if the United States economy goes into recession, Apple doesn't fail. It has customers in India, Europe, and China. If the dollar collapses, BlackRock doesn't go broke. It owns assets in every currency, in every jurisdiction. They have hedged their exposure. They have executed the Dutch exit. They are physically present in New York and Washington. But their loyalty is to the global flow of capital, not to the land or the people of the United States. And just like the Dutch middle class in 1780, the American middle class is fracturing. Real wage growth has stagnated since 1973. American life expectancy, uniquely among developed nations, has declined. Social trust has collapsed. Infrastructure receives failing grades, but the stock market hits all-time highs. How does this end? If we follow the Dutch script, it doesn't end with an apocalypse. The Netherlands is still there. Amsterdam is still a beautiful city. But it's a museum. It's a tourist destination. It's no longer a shaper of history. For the United States, the fall will look different. We won't become a French puppet state, but we may become something else, a nation of extreme wealth at the top, living in fortified enclaves, surrounded by a sea of poverty and instability. The government will remain, but it will be weak, paralyzed by debt, and incapable of solving big problems. The real power will reside not in Washington, but in corporate boardrooms and decentralized networks. The American empire will technically exist on maps, but it will be a hollow shell. The action will have moved elsewhere. This is the lesson of the Dutch pattern. Empires do not die by murder. They die by suicide. They die when their ruling class realizes that there's more profit in exit than in investment, when capital holders choose to fund their rivals rather than their own nation, when the elite detach their destiny from the destiny of their people. The tragic irony is that it's rational for each individual actor. It made sense for a Dutch banker in 1770 to buy British bonds. It makes sense for an American fund manager in 2026 to invest in China. But what's rational for the individual is suicide for the empire. History teaches us that financialization is not sophistication. It is the beginning of the end. When a nation stops making things and starts making money from money, when it exports its capital rather than investing at home, when its elite build lifeboats for themselves and drill holes in the hull for everyone else, that nation has entered the death spiral. The pattern is clear. The parallels are undeniable. And the question is, will we learn from the Dutch, or will we follow them into irrelevance? This is The Hidden History. Subscribe now, because when the history books are written about the fall of the American empire, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.